As we're looking at these muscles, we're really looking at what I would call the macroscopic anatomy right now. So when I show you that muscle man, or I just drew that drawing, that's looking macroscopically, something I could see with the human eye. But then we're going to have to talk a little bit about what I would call microscopic anatomy, things that I could not, structures I could not see without the use of a microscope. So let's, again, thinking of the picture of macroscopic anatomy and carrying that on, we're just going to draw the same muscle one more time. We're just going to stick this bone up here. We already all know that that bone is actually going to be the femur. We know there's going to be some epicondyles and some condyles, and we know that muscle is going to work its way down. So I'm just going to make this nice and simple and work this muscle down. And as I work it down, I'm going to end up at the calcaneus down here. So it's basically the same drawing you just looked at. So just kind of think that this was the O back up here. That was my origin. And this was my I, or that was my insertion. But what I want to show you now about what's called the macroscopic anatomy is muscle is made out of structures. It's made out of individual pieces. Okay? So I think the easiest way to just explain that to you is kind of think that, let's start from the smallest piece of a muscle to a muscle. And I know that if you started out at the smallest structure of muscle, I would say it would be something called A or actin. And actin is a thin protein myofilament. And I'm just going to make it real simple for right now. Just remember, this is going to be a thin, light, CHON standing for protein, and then myo is the prefix for muscle, filament. And once I have actin's going to combine with something called, the next bigger structure called M, which is myosin. And it's very similar, except myosin, instead of being thin, is going to be thick. Instead of being light, it's going to be dark. And it's going to be a protein, same thing, made of CHON, myofilament. And then I take actin and myosin, and I put those together. And when I put those together, they form something called a sarcomere. Remember, we're talking about skeletal muscle here. So a sarcomere is basically, when I put the actin and myosin together, it's going to end up with a sarcomere, which is going to be called a functional unit of skeletal muscle. So again, I can't see actin and myosin and sarcomeres without the aid of a microscope. So I'm looking first over here, just shifting you over to kind of starting out with microscopic and work my way up to macroscopic so you can understand what I'm trying to draw here. And then I'm going to take a bunch of sarcomeres and I'm going to have a thing called myofibrils. And that's going to be a cylindrical bunch or bundle of sarcomeres. Still can't see those without the aid of a microscope. Then I'm going to take these myofibrils and I'm going to group those together and I'm going to turn those into bundles. And bundles are going to be also called fascicles. And that's going to be groups of myofibrils, making muscle bundles or muscle fascicles. And then I'm going to group muscle bundles and fascicles together, and I'm going to make a muscle cell. And a muscle cell is going to also be called a muscle fiber. And a muscle fiber is also going to be called a myocyte. And finally, I'm going to take those muscle cells or fibers, which now, once I kind of get into these bundles, I'm going to be able to see those macroscopically. So everything from here up is microscopic. But once I get to bundles, I can actually visualize that without a microscope. Then I go to muscle cells, fibers, or myocytes, and then those group together. And as they group together, they're going to end up being the muscle. So just kind of think that these groups are going to come together. And so I don't want to confuse you too much here, because the one thing that you have to be careful of here is some muscles don't have these nice bundles and fascicles. So I'm just going to put something like this, going to put an arrow that kind of goes a little bit like that. Okay? Because some muscles will not have real bundles, and they'll just have a bunch of muscle cells that are coming together. But to kind of think of the big picture, how things will bundle together. And so I'll show you that when I go to this. So just think of how this all works. So I'm just going to just write it one more time here so you can just get the big picture. So if I started out with a muscle, this could be any muscle, but we know that this muscle here is the gastrocnemius, because I know it looks like it's starting at the femur and it's ending down here at the calcaneus. And I know that that muscle, if I was looking, for example, at this muscle, did you notice how it seems to group together like this? So it looks to me like this is a muscle that's got a bunch of bundles. So the muscle is made out of bundles. And bundles are also called fascicles. And then I'm going to take these bundles, because this muscle has bundles. And therefore, the next smaller structure that's making up each of these lines here, those are going to be what are called cells. And the cells are going to be fibers. And the fibers are going to be myocytes. So it's a little confusing because it all depends on the muscle. It's just like, if you kind of look on the side of your jaw here, I can feel on the side of my face there's a muscle that starts here on what's called the ramus of the mandible, and it works its way down onto my jaw. So it starts really up here on my temporal bone, which we've already talked about, and it's going to work its way all the way down to the top of my mandible, called a temporalis. So it's going to be real wide at the top and real narrow at the bottom. That's a muscle that's going to have bundles called convergent bundles. All right? So then I'm going to have cells, fibers, or myocytes. And those cells, fibers, or myocytes then are going to be made out of myofibrils. And myofibrils, remember, are cylindrical bundles of sarcomeres. So there's that bundle word that kind of makes you get confused here. And then myofibrils are going to be made out of sarcomeres. And sarcomeres are then made out of those two protein myofilaments, which are going to be A. actin and M. myosin. So again, we just want to get what I would call the big picture here and understand it's not It's not really that simple, but we're going to try and simplify it. Now, if I was to say, well, here's that muscle, and I'm just going to draw the muscle itself. So I know that this muscle came from this bone. And I'm just going to not draw this anatomically perfect here, because all I want to do is do some representational. And I'm going to bring this muscle down like this. And therefore, I do see now the entire muscle. I'm drawing a little bit thicker than normal so you can see the big picture here. So I know that inside of this muscle called the gastrocnemius are going to be cells. And this is larger than life, but this is a cell. This is a muscle cell. So that in the middle there is a cell, or a myocyte, or a fiber. And now I'm going to take that muscle cell or fiber. I know it's going to have a covering. So if you've ever looked at a steak or looked at a piece of meat, you kind of see kind of a white fibrous material. That's actually connective tissue. And a lot of times people will say, that if a steak is kind of tough or chewy, that's because you're seeing a lot of this, the way it was cut, and you're seeing a lot of this connective tissue. So therefore, each of the individual muscle cells, which is what this is, this muscle cell is covered by an endomysium. So an endomysium covers a cell. And there's a term I keep on using here of CT. Remember, CT in this class stands for connective tissue. Remember, all connective tissue is a mesodermal germ layer. Don't confuse that with the word computerized tomography that you have in radiography. So these muscle cells now are covered by this endomysium. And I'm just going to draw this again larger than life, but there's another cell sitting next to it. So here's another cell. And then I'm just going to draw one more in here. And again, I couldn't see this like this other than orientation if I looked at muscle. But if you notice, I've just got 3 cells here. And I'm just going to encircle those 3 cells and say those 3 cells together comprise the bundle. So this is actually a muscle bundle. And a muscle bundle is called a fascicle. And that muscle bundle or fascicle is going to have a connective tissue covering. So I'm just going to, again, just darken it so you can picture in your mind what I'm talking about. So this muscle bundle or muscle fascicle is going to have a connective tissue covering. This is what you could actually see if you looked at a steak or any type of meat at a butcher shop. You'd actually see those white fibers. So therefore, this is going to be called the perimysium. And the perimysium is going to cover the bundle. And then, since I've got an entire muscle here, and I'm just going to draw on this outer layer of this entire muscle called the gastroc, and just, again, for representational purposes, so you can see what I'm talking about, that this dark line that I'm shading in here that covers the entire muscle is actually going to be called the epimysium. And that's going to cover the muscle. So at the end of the day, it basically is saying that there's 3 connective tissue coverings found in muscle. There's a connective tissue covering that covers the entire muscle called the epimysium. Cells, muscles that are bundled together and have a bundle appearance or a fascicle appearance are going to have muscle bundles covered by an by a paramysium, which is going to cover the bundles. So there's a bundle, this encircled area. And then each of those muscle bundles is going to have a cell. So there's 1, 2, 3 cells here. And each of those individual cells has its own connective tissue covering called an endomysium, which covers this cell. So that's how you want to start thinking of what I would call the big picture of muscle. Now, two terms that I think that are always significant, whether you're talking about bones, whether you're talking about muscles, whether you're talking about organs, talking about cancer, and it's that two words that I've probably talked about before called hypertrophy. Remember, hyper means increase. So hypertrophy is going to be defined as a increase in cell size, but not cell number. So if I have a muscle that is enlarging, but it's not in the number of muscle cells, that's hypertrophy. Okay? So the difference between that is the word hyperplasia. Hyperplasia means I've got an increase in cell number, but not size. So when I think of a cancer condition, just remember that cancer really is that I've got uncontrolled cell division. So if I've got uncontrolled cell division, cancer is a hyperplastic pathology versus hypertrophy, which is just an enlargement of it. If I were to go to the gym every day, I'll give you a very simple example. If I was looking at skeletal muscle, which the gastrocnemius is a great example, skeletal muscle undergoes normally hypertrophy. I mean, you don't make more muscles. You just have more sarcomeres, which increase the size of the muscle. Okay? But if I had a tumor of a skeletal muscle, it would be a hyperplastic condition, which would be an increase in the number of muscle cells. So just kind of think those terms can be used interchangeably and often intertwined based upon whether we're talking about normal versus pathology. So skeletal muscle undergoes hypertrophy. So if you said to me, number of nuclei per cell. Well, we know there's 3 types of muscle, right? We know that the 3 types of muscle the first type is smooth or involuntary. Smooth or involuntary has only got one nucleus per cell. I've got a second type of muscle called skeletal, which is what the gastrocnemius is. Of course, skeletal muscle is going to be voluntary. I can tell it what to do, just like the gastrocnemius. Except the difference is I'm going to have 100 to 1,000 nuclei per cell. Well, that tells you that, when someone goes to the gym, are they going to, if I normally have 657 muscles, if I go to the gym, am I going to have 690? And the guy that never goes to the gym is only going to have 400? No, it tells me that we're all going to have theoretically the same number of muscles. It's just that skeletal muscle is going to undergo hypertrophy. And so therefore, the person that, for example, went to the gym every day would probably have more like 1,000 nuclei per cell. The person that was what I would call a couch potato would only have 100 nuclei per cell. So those are things that are very important to think about. And then, of course, in this course, we're also going to talk about cardiac muscle. And the difference, of course, here is that cardiac muscle is going to be an involuntary muscle, but it's going to be striated. So skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are both going to be striated. Striated means they're striped, whereas smooth muscle is not. So therefore, cardiac muscle, even though it's got 1 to 2 nuclei per cell, cardiac muscle is going to be the most organized muscle of all three. So again, just think of the big picture. You want to think again, hypertrophy, hyperplasia. I'll give you a great example. Person has a MI, so always think of examples in anatomy. You have a patient that had an MI, or a myocardial infarction. Well, let's see. Myo means muscle. Cardial means heart. Infarction means dead. It's tissue that's dead. So the person has some dead tissue in his heart. What does his heart do? His heart says, this heart has got some dead tissue in its wall. So I think bigger is better, my heart thinks. So when someone has a myocardial infarction, one thing that can happen is they can undergo hyperplasia. So the difference between cardiac muscle, it can undergo hyperplasia and hypertrophy. You not only will end up having more muscle cells, but you're going to have larger muscle cells. And of course, the heart, as I always say, is not very smart, because bigger is not better in the heart, because that would be called cardiomegaly. Bigger is better if you were talking about skeletal muscle, because it would be stronger. But kind of think that if I had a heart chamber and it got larger, the more larger volume of the heart chamber would have to have more contractibility. It would have to push harder to get the same amount of blood pushed out of the chamber. Okay? And so that's how you want to look at it. So again, big picture, smooth muscle. Smooth muscle is going to undergo normally hyperplasia. Why? Well, because I have to build new blood vessels all the time. So when I build new blood vessels, and blood vessels have to have a blood supply and have to have vessels, and the vessels have to go supply the muscle, therefore I'm going to have increase in the number of them, so I'm going to have hyperplasia. But I could also have a tumor of smooth muscle, so therefore I can have hyperplasia and I can have hypertrophy. I can have the same thing in heart muscle, but not in skeletal. And skeletal muscle always undergoes hypertrophy. I don't make more muscle. I only increase the size of muscle. Okay?